We're from a charity, a small charity called Dementia Carers Count. And in case you haven't heard of us, we are quite a small organisation, but we have a national remit. And our mission is to support family or friends who care for someone with dementia. And I think we're probably the only organisation actually that are dedicated to supporting the carer, so the informal carer of someone with dementia. We do this through providing free courses, whether they're face-to-face or whether they are digital. And we actually run a specialist course for people who are caring for someone with young onset dementia, as we know that the experiences are different from older carers. And so it's an opportunity for carers to be together and share those experiences around juggling work, finances, and caring for a spouse. As with most organisations, we've now gone online, so we have lots of live online digital sessions running as well at the moment around over 20 topics, and it's where we share knowledge and we facilitate peer support. So we know from the courses that we run that carers really value the time together and the sharing of experiences. So our session today is aimed primarily at unpaid carers and people with dementia, but we hope whoever you are, whether you're living with dementia, whether you work in the profession, you all come with knowledge and experience, but we hope that you find it interesting and useful. So we're briefly going to introduce ourselves. So as Tessa said, my name is Lizzie. I'm one of the practitioners at Dementia Carers Count. I am a speech and language therapist by background, and I've largely worked in the NHS in my career, working with people with brain changes. I now have been with Dementia Carers Count for a couple of years, and I am part of the team that deliver the courses and develop the courses. And I also have personal experience of caring because I supported my mum who had dementia. So Sue, could I ask you to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Lizzie. So I'm Sue Hinds. I'm also at Dementia Carers Count as a practitioner, also a speech and language therapist by background, and worked many years in the NHS in memory assessment services, community mental health teams and inpatients. And I joined DCC 3 years ago, but I came full-time last year as head of services.
Thank you. Jill, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, hello, my name is Jill Davidson. I look after my husband, Paul Davidson, who lives with behavioural variant frontotemporal dementia. I'm actually a member of the Dementia Carers Count advisory panel because I did a course with them in 2018, and they were very supportive of me, and I'm an advocate for the charity.
Thanks, Jill. And Sarah, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Sarah. I look after my partner Ian, who has familial Alzheimer's disease, or known as FAD, and he got diagnosed 10 years ago at the age of 50, although I'd say he had symptoms from his very early 40s. So that's it. And I've been to the Dementia Carers Count couple of courses. They're fabulous. And now I'm talking to other people.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. So let's get started because we've got loads to get through. So what we're going to do today is, first of all, well, what is stress and distress? What are we talking about? So we're going to define that. We're going to look at the symptoms of it, then have a look at what might be causing some of those stress and distress symptoms and behaviours. I'm going to look at fight or flight. I'm sure you've heard of the fight or flight, so we're going to go into that a little bit and look at something called the time intensity model. And then we're going to bring in Jill and Sarah, and we're going to have a discussion with them about their experiences of dealing with stress and distress reactions, and how they manage that, and also how they manage that for themselves as well, because that's also really important to us, is how carers look after themselves. And finally, we're going to finish on ideas around how to reduce that level of stress for the person with dementia, but also for the carer. Okay, so what is stress and distress? So it is traditionally was referred to as challenging behaviour, and it was really introduced, that term was really introduced to describe behaviour that was really challenging to carers, to family, to professional staff. It then sort of morphed into this term called behaviours that challenge, because it sort of it felt slightly like it was taking the emphasis off that someone was just doing something to challenge you. But now really it should be referred to as stress and distress, because that description more accurately and usefully really reflects what's going on for the individual. So i.e. it's a person's reaction to something that's stressful in their world or in their environment. And then it also captures the distress that that causes them. That's not to say, however, that you may not hear those terms still, and I'm sure there are quite a few services that still use the term challenging behaviour or behaviours that challenge, but that's what we are now referring to as stress and distress. So I hope that's made that clear. So the way that we want to present this to you today is to sort of think about this iceberg metaphor. And actually this whole idea of this iceberg metaphor was kind of introduced in the 90s around autistic spectrum disorder. But in the early 2000s, there was a psychologist called Ian James, and he started to develop it in terms of thinking about dementia care. And he used it to sort of help explain that link between the symptoms you see, but the underlying factors that contribute to those symptoms. So the tip of the iceberg is what you can see and what you can hear. It's the expression of someone's stress and distress. And what lies below is what might be causing that stress and distress. So it's like any disease. You will have symptoms and then you will have an underlying cause. And so if I take an example that's perhaps non-dementia related, if I have a headache, I take a tablet. So I have a headache, I take a tablet, it's fine. If I have a headache for 2 weeks, I take a tablet to help with the symptoms, which is pain. But actually, I think this is not right. There has to be something going on here. So I go to the GP. The GP is going to prescribe me probably stronger painkillers to help manage those symptoms. But what a GP is also going to do is then start to think about, right, well, what is actually causing these? We don't just treat the symptoms, we've got to look at what the cause is. So they may carry out a specialist assessment or refer me for assessment. And it's exactly the same kind of principle that we're now thinking about in terms of looking at stress and distress and dementia. So if you're lucky enough to live in an area that has a specialist dementia team, and if you have a person who is experiencing stress and distress, if that person was referred, that team would look at those symptoms, but it would also be really important for them to try and look and see what are the underlying causes. And they would look therefore at what is below the waterline. And they might do that through talking to the professionals, talking to family, talking to friends, and some more specialist assessment where they may observe the person, observe the environment, and try and work out what's going on and what's triggering those feelings of stress. So let's focus first of all on the tip of the iceberg. So this is really what we see and what we hear, okay? So I'm sure we've all experienced feelings of stress in our lives. And for all of us, we have very unique and different ways of expressing that stress. And in actual fact, I could probably look at some of those things on that list and think on one occasion I reacted like this, and on another occasion I reacted like that. So it's not always a consistent reaction that people are going to have either. This is not an exhaustive list of how people may behave when they're stressed. You may recognize some behaviors in yourself, you may recognize some behaviors in people that you care for. But it could be, for example, that people have quite obsessive behavior or repetitive questioning. Sometimes when people feel stressed, they actually feel quite angry and can feel quite aggressive. And that might result in them being quite disruptive or verbally abusive. Sometimes people might be putting themselves at danger or want to sort of hurt themselves, or they might actually end up being quite antisocial in their behaviour because actually they're trying to express something, but then perhaps don't have the communication skills to be able to really tell you what's going on. So all of those are quite obvious, aren't they? Quite sort of negative, overt signs. But it's really worth bearing in mind as well that sometimes when people are stressed, they can really withdraw and they can become very quiet, and they can really disengage with the people around them and the environment that they're in. And again, this is something I think that when I'm stressed, sometimes I just go very quiet. So we've talked about the sort of behaviour there, but how might that actually manifest? What kinds of things might we see people do? What does it really look like when someone is stressed? So again, you might look at this list and see there's lots of behaviours perhaps you do. I can look at this list and see there's loads of behaviours that I do when I am stressed. So it might be that someone is just feeling very, very upset all the time. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but it's just an example of some ideas. Argumentative, so arguing every point. No, that didn't happen. It wasn't like this. No, I don't see it like that. You know, just that not being able to accept what you're saying. Swearing because people are really frustrated, not doing what you're suggesting that they might do. Sometimes people might shout, they might hit, they might even spit. Sometimes people have a real need to walk. This is something I can really empathise with, just as a person who, when I feel stressed, I feel like I have this energy that I need to walk off, and it helps me feel better if I've actually got rid of some of that energy. In fact, that kind of need to walk as well was something that we used to call wandering, but we don't really call it wandering anymore, because that suggests that people are aimlessly roaming around. And kind of we know now that even if it looks like someone might not be walking with a purpose, we actually know that they are, whether that purpose is to look for something, whether it's to get somewhere, whether it's to get away from something, or whether it is this expression of just dealing with the stress because it helps them calm down. Again, there might be repetitive questioning, repetitive behaviours you might see, again, that withdrawal, and this sort of delusional beliefs where someone might say something that's happened or accuse someone of doing something, and you think, well, no, that hasn't happened. You've never met that person didn't steal that, we've never been there. That sort of saying things that you think, well, that just simply isn't the case, that isn't true. So I'm going to pass on to Sue now, who's going to take us under the waterline.
Thanks, Lizzie. So I'm glad Lizzie was able to say that also all of these behaviours happen to her, because they certainly happen to me in certain events as well, and I think we can all relate to them. But what we've got now is we're looking at the underneath the waterline, and it's much bigger than what is on the top of the waterline, isn't it? There's this huge mound underneath. And the bigger that mound gets, the more it pushes the iceberg up out of the water. So if we have more things going on that stress us and distress us, we're going to see more of those agitated behaviours or stressful behaviours and distressed responses from someone. And I've said here that some of them are intrinsic and some of them are extrinsic. Sometimes it's difficult to work out which is which. So when we talk about intrinsic, we're talking about ones that are happening for the person that we cannot change. Perhaps it's a pain that is chronic, that can't be treated, and we cannot get rid of that for the person. Or it may be the dementia, and how the dementia is working its way through its brain is making it intrinsic. And we can't do anything about that. But it doesn't mean that we can't extrinsically do something to support the individual. So we might be able to alter medications. We might be able to validate how they're feeling and enter into their world. But there are also the extrinsic ones which we really can change, and that might be about making the environment easier for the person to navigate, being able to give the right support for people around eating, drinking, getting dressed and so on, so that life is much easier because we've extrinsically made those changes. But there are some on the borderline as well, so we can think about maybe if somebody is having problems thinking about or is in one moment in time, let's say, and do we try to meet them in that moment of time and extrinsically change our ways so that rather than challenging and causing further distress by arguing about facts, we're entering into the moment with the person that makes it easier. So going on to the next slide, if you can, Lizzie, thank you. So these are some of the things that can be under the waterline. And it may be, as I say, that these beliefs that I'm still in my 20s, I need to go to work. We can't intrinsically change that in that person in that moment of time, maybe, but we can meet with them. It might be medication related issues. So it might be interactions with drugs. Some could be changed, should not. It could be mental health status, perceptual difficulties. If there are changes in the brain, we might not be able to change what the person is seeing or how they're perceiving things. But again, we can change the environment. And physical difficulties, I know Jill is going to sort of touch on this when she's talking with Lizzie around here, how some of the physical difficulties get manifested as a dementia, but actually they're a physical difficulty that needs treating. And if that physical difficulty can be treated, then we start to change what we're seeing as stress and distress. So lots of things in there, and it's certainly something we like to go into great detail with carers to look at how we can support and look at what might be going on for an individual. So can I have the next slide, please, Lizzie? Thank you. So when somebody is having stress or distress, I mean, I will just take us to the physical difficulties. I know that if I've got a headache, like Lizzie mentioned, or I've got terrible back pain, I'm more likely to trigger a stress response if somebody does something that antagonizes me or something happens in the environment. So if I've got a really bad headache and a low-flying plane goes over, which they often do where I live, that's just going to trigger a stress response in me. And the stress response, I think you've all probably heard of the fight or flight response. And it's this primitive response that's there to keep us safe. It's there to try and help us to survive during moments. And we don't need it as much as we used to in the past, but it's there just to keep us safe. Just to say, it does come out in excitement as well as fear. It's not just a fight or flight to get away from something. It can also be triggered if we're very excited, and you'll see children get overexcited in a sweet shop, and this is their fight or flight coming out in them. And it's not just fight or flight. I think we all recognise now that people might fight. So if they get under stress, then we all can get angry. If somebody cut me up on the road, I'd get angry and I'd be shouting in my car, what did you do that for? Other people will flight, maybe just pull into the lay-by and go, I don't want to go anymore. Sometimes it's freeze. So you just freeze and you think, I can't go anywhere now, I'm really scared. Sometimes it's flock, and you'll often see children do that with a low-flying aircraft. They'll flock to the teacher and try and get support in numbers, and we're all capable of doing that. And then flop. The flop is like my dog does when he's in trouble, and he flops on his back and becomes submissive. So we all do different types of things that when there's a fight or flight response. And the fight or flight response is often very active for somebody with dementia. So can I have the next slide, please, Lizzie? So this is a picture of the brain, and the curly whirly bit on the top is the cortex. So I've got the cortex overlying here, and this is primarily the part that gets affected for people with dementia. And we also know that in young onset dementia, it's often more the frontal areas. Some of the dementias that are experienced in young onset dementia are some of the more frontal area dementias. And this frontal area is responsible for our reasoning and our planning and our control. And then deep underneath this cortex is a little, it's a walnut shape, not white and square, but I'm just using it for the example at the moment, is this fight or flight response, and it's called your amygdala. And your amygdala is always on the alert. It's scanning around for any trouble, anything that's going to happen. I can hear a train now, that's going to get mine going. But so it's scanning around and it's looking, it's just keeping aware in case something happens, it can come out and do a fight, a flight, a freeze, a flock, or a flop, or something like that. And so it's sitting there. And what happens is when I meet that car on the junction that crosses over me, he jumps out and this fight or flight is going, right, I'm really cross with you about that. And then my frontal lobe says, okay, just let it go. He's bigger than you are. You're safe. It's okay. If you get out here, you're likely to get your car damaged by the cars coming down the road. And I am able to use my frontal lobe to reason through and plan and have some emotional control over what I'm thinking and inhibit my responses. But if this is weakening for somebody with dementia and this is getting weaker, it isn't as strong to hold down its fight or flight. It's not holding it down so well. So what happens literally, I flip my lid or I blow my top, and we've all flipped our lid and we've all blown our top, but it's just more able to do it if this is weak because of a dementia. So can I have a next slide, please, Lizzie? So on this next slide, we've got what's called the time intensity model that Lizzie said we would cover. The emotional intensity is at the side, so that's how emotionally intense you're feeling. And then we've got a timeline across the bottom. And all of us usually start at a point of calm. We're at the point, you know, our amygdala is there, it's scanning, it's not asleep, it's always there on the lookout for you. And then we have the trigger come along. So it might be this car cutting me up on the road. I get a trigger and it starts to make me agitated and my emotional intensity starts to rise and rise and rise. until it gets to an absolute peak when I do whatever I might do about a man cutting me up on the road. I won't tell you what that might be, but I get to that peak, and then the moment passes and my emotional intensity starts to come back down the other side. I start to de-escalate. I go into sort of a recovery. I get calmer. And usually, I'm sure most of you will sort of recognize that after you've had a really emotional intense period, you go into a slump. You sort of almost go past calm, and you kind of go into a little bit of a burnout mode before you come back up into sort of that baseline calmness again. And sometimes we have wobbles coming back down that curve because we rethink about it. We start coming down, we think, I can't believe he did that, and we're back up, and then slowly we come back down. And because it takes us a while to come back down, this time intensity can take 90 minutes or so for us generally to get to the bottom of that curve. Now, if that curve was the same for somebody with dementia who has a memory problems as well, at 90 minutes, this might have happened, but they have no recall over what the event was to be able to tell you what that event was that had happened. So the feelings are still there. The feelings are still sort of churning around, but they can't think of what it was that happened. But it doesn't tend to happen like this because the person has lots of brain changes. So they've constantly got more stresses and coming along that cause more curves. So can I have the next slide, please, Lizzie? So this is really what the slide looks like. Now, I'm afraid it's handwritten drawn on my second drawing, so it's not a great line really, but that's more what it looks like, because a person might start the day at calm, and then something triggers an action, something, you reach a peak, you just start coming down, but then it may be a shadow on the wall that you've misinterpreted, and that sends you back up. Then you start coming back down, but you can't do your buttons up on your jumper, and that starts you back up again. Or somebody says something and is arguing with you about the point of where you are in time, and then that peaks you even further than your original peak. So we're now not at 90 minutes before we come back down. We're a lot longer. So it's much more difficult for the person to be able to recall what had happened, and much more exhaustion, but also much more intense distress that's seen by people. So what next? Sorry, thank you. So why is it more difficult? I think I've really said it in the main, really. It's more difficult for a person with dementia perhaps to calm down. One is we have a tendency to say calm down. Now, I don't know about you, but if anyone says calm down to me, that's not helpful to me at all, because actually what I need is validation to know that that's how you feel. So one of the things I say is calm down is not a good phrase to use, but it's because the person has a heightened state of arousal. So the physiological, this chimp is already out. He's already got his cortisol going, and he's already working at it. I don't know why he's a he, sorry, mine's a he. He's already got his cortisol up and running. So the stress hormones are already much higher in the body. And so things take over and they lose their perspective. And it's scary when you lose control. So that just gives you another peak. You've had the peak of the stress, then you're scared because you feel you're out of control, and that gives you another peak on that curve. So thinking straight is really quite difficult for a person in the heat of the moment. And this cortical weakening isn't able to control this sort of strive to survive, really, I guess. So I'm going to hand back now to Lizzie, I think, who's going to have a discussion with Jill and Sarah about these types of things.
Thanks very much, Sue. So far we've kind of looked at some of the theory, I suppose, and a little bit of an explanation about what stress and distress is, and sort of the peak about how that happens. And what I want to do now is to bring Jill and Sarah in to talk about experiences that they've had, not only in stress and distress within the person that they may be caring for, but actually in themselves as well. I'm going to take us back to a slide, this slide here. And first of all, I wanted to ask you, do any of these sort of resonate with you? And if so, if you could tell us a little bit more about that, and perhaps some strategies that you may use to reduce the stress and distress for the person that you care for. So if I could come to Sarah first.
Hi. Okay, so at the moment with Ian, it's the bottom half of the list that resonates with me. But when I was looking after my stepmother over 10 years ago, also with dementia, the top half was definitely every day. And I suppose I learned on the job with her. So I did learn quite a few strategies Didn't really work with her because by the time I learnt those strategies, she was too far gone. But I've definitely instigated those with Ian, and possibly also he's a calmer type of person anyway. So yes, he needs to walk around a lot, very repetitive questioning, or even just repetitive statements all the time. He doesn't really withdraw. I suppose that's because of the way I treat him. And he does have delusions. So do you want me to expand on some of those now?
Please. Yeah, that would be great.
Okay, so with his delusions, it's mainly at night time when he's woken up. He thinks that he's a kid back at home. And so he'll say to me things like, "Where's Dad?" in a quite a childish voice. So instead of bursting his bubble, I go, "Oh, Dad's away," or "Dad's in the other room asleep. It's still nighttime. We better stay asleep or Dad might get mad." Just something which works at his sort of childish level that he's at now. In the daytime, it happens to be whenever we're watching something similar to what he might have watched as a kid. So say he might be watching the football or the snooker while I'm reading, and he'll say, "Did I put my bike away?" And I can tell that he's back in that childish mode. Or like when his parents split up, and then he might go, "Oh, after this, will we go around and visit Mum?" And so of course his mother now lives like 300 miles away from us. So I realize he's talking about when he lived at home as a kid. And so I'll just say, "Oh no, we can't go today. We have to stay home." Or I just go along with it. There's no point trying to talk him out of it at that moment. Needing to walk. So luckily he still is able to go for a walk on his own. I've got a tracker that I use that links in with my phone. We also go for a walk a few times a week. He walks around the house quite a lot. I sometimes ask him, "You okay up there, darling?" He's been walking around upstairs for like half an hour. I try not to let it get to me, but he goes, "Yeah, I'm okay. I'm just tidying up." And I think, okay, I'll just sort that out later, because tidying up is the opposite of tidying up usually. And the repetitive questioning, I mean, he can't help it. So I just find new ways to keep answering the same question, or when he says, "Oh, like it's raining now. It was really nice earlier, wasn't it?" And say it hasn't been nice earlier, but I go along with it. I go, "Yeah, it was. This weather, we're living in England, we better move back to Australia." I just sort of carry on, deflect a little bit, start talking about something else. I just sort of, my bottom line all the time is keep him happy, and that keeps me happy.
Yeah.
He can't help any of this. And yeah, so that's it at the moment.
That's really interesting, Sarah. Thank you. What really strikes me as well about what you're saying is about how you are sort of meeting him where he is, and you're not bringing him back to sort of reality and saying, "Well, no, that isn't what it is," because actually you know that all that's going to do is cause distress.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Trying to explain to him, "Your father died 10 years ago," like that'd be awful to hear suddenly, especially if he's still in his kid mode. Imagine telling a child that your father is dead.
Absolutely. Yeah.
At the beginning, I was saying that because I wasn't ready for the delusions, and I'd be like, "Darling, your father died 10 years ago." He was like, "What?" And I do also remember that with my stepmother, her brother coming to visit her and her saying, "Where are Daddy and Mummy?" And he said, "Daddy and Mummy, they're buried in Jamaica." And she just burst out crying because she couldn't remember any of that. She was in her childlike thing.
Yeah.
So yeah. It's not just meet them halfway. You're going 90%. They're just going 10%. I think. Yeah.
And interesting as well, what you're saying, almost like the training you've had, because you've done this caring before, and that's what really strikes me, as actually most of us don't have the caring training, do we? We just find ourselves in this situation where we have to do it, and you're in this position where
I made serious mistakes.
Yeah.
Oh God! But I was learning on the job. Or like, when she would like shout at me for literally no reason, and I'd shout back. Oh God, I realized how stupid that was of me.
It's human. But thanks very much for that, Sarah.
Okay.
Jill, could I bring you in now? Looking at this list, what sort of stands out for you?
Similarly, the bottom half of the list is quite a common feature for us. Because Paul has behavioural variant frontotemporal dementia, his function of emotions and everything else are disappearing. And although Sarah was saying, people can get very upset about it, he doesn't seem to get as upset when, I'm afraid I do sometimes lose my rag and shout and scream at him sometimes, and I know what I've done wrong, but you've got to live with it and get it on, move on. However, he's a very happy and contented sort of person, and we have the repetitive, lots of walking and pacing up and down. We've got a track in our garden which has been worn out by Paul walking round and round and round the grass, and that's his walking track. And yeah, we walk along the street and it's, who's this coming along, and is this a person we know or not? I say, and I'm usually now say, well, what do you think, who do you think it is? And as they get nearer to us, he works out for himself, no, it's not his son or his best friend, whatever. But yeah, it takes a lot of time to get used to that, but we've been doing it now for 5 years. So and I think my whole feelings about how you deal with this is to glean as much knowledge as possible about the disease, and knowledge is key for you as a carer to understand what they're going through, but also to understand yourself what you're going through, because I think as carers we beat ourselves up about how we feel about the person and how they've changed or how they're changing, and how we might feel we're failing in looking after them properly, etc., etc. So I think the more you understand about their brain disease, the better that you can cope with it yourself and help them as well.
Yeah, totally. I think for some people still the idea of dementia is so scary that I think some people don't really seek out that information, do they? No. But the fact is, it's happening, whatever it is, it's happening. And I think you're right, the more that you know, and that's certainly something on the course that we try to sort of explain as well, is that the more that you know, that what you're able to deal with and not able to deal with. And if you have an understanding of why someone might be doing or saying something that may feel puzzling, then that's helpful, because at least you can understand why it's happening.
Yeah, and I also think it's so daunting to hear what's coming down the line. You can shut yourself off from it because you think, I just don't want to have to deal with that. So, understanding what might be happening, but dealing with it at the moment and learning to live in the moment it's a cliche, but it's vitally important to do that, because we can only cope with so much of what is going on, and do it, keep doing it a day at a time, and be aware of what might be further down. So in your support groups, if you meet people who are at a later stage in the disease than you are, or just starting out, just get and glean information from them, but don't get too worried by it.
Everyone's experience is unique as well, and you don't quite know what's down the line for you. It might be something quite different, so it's always about not assuming, I suppose, isn't it? It sounds like you also benefit from kind of like meeting other carers. Is that right, Jill?
Yes. I'm involved with 2 support groups for FTD from the Rare Dementia Support Group, and we've buddied up with meeting up on Zoom calls and all the rest of it over the last year's pandemic, and also a local charity of support care for supporting carers of all different dementias, and the Alzheimer's Society we deal with. And I experience a lot of people with Alzheimer's and their issues, and I often think, well, that's nothing totally different from the disease that my husband's living with. But there are lots of common areas, and we're all caring for people in our way, and dealing with all these issues.
Yes, it can feel quite isolating sometimes, can't it? Sarah, how do you sort of look after yourself? How do you manage sort of the stress and distress that this may cause you?
So I'm a great planner. I plan ahead. I was like that anyway, so I haven't changed. I sort of have 3 levels now. It's planning ahead for the future. Example of that is I'm actually looking for respite care for Ian right now, because I want to go to Australia next year and see my children. So people like Jill was mentioning, who might have their head in the sand, no, I'm in denial, this isn't really happening. You'll have a disaster, an emergency, something will crop up, and you're just not prepared. So I want to go to Australia. The only way is he has to be in respite. So next week I'm looking at the care homes. And even though I hate that thought of it, I want to be in denial, like this couldn't be happening to us, but it is happening. You've got to be a realist. And as Jill said, also knowledge is power. So that's my sort of far away level. Then I have my weekly, I still work on a filofax, I'm old school. every week I plan the week fairly intensely, I suppose. As I'm running the whole house, I look after Ian and my father, so I'm running it for all of us. And then on a daily basis, I'm doing what you might call micromanaging. So example of that is Ian goes to the shower, I get his clothes ready onto the bed. When he gets out, I say the same thing every day. Your clothes are on the bed, darling. But of course, I have to stay in the room while he's getting dressed because he can no longer really do it. And without wanting to point out to him, you can't even get dressed anymore, I just stand around pretending I'm looking at my jewelry or reading the paper or something. And then when he starts putting the shirt on wrongly, I go, oh, do you want me to help you? And he might say no. And then when he's clearly put the sleeve on inside out, upside down, back to front, every possible wrong way except the right way, I go, oh, here, let me help you. That looks a bit of tangle. Although maybe if he's got the jumper on back to front, I think, no, pick your battles. Let's leave that one. Because there's only so many times a day you can actually correct them or do it for them. As much as they have dementia, they are aware if you have corrected them 50 times before lunchtime, they're feeling a little bit sorry for themselves. Yeah. So I just choose the ones I really, really need to do. Yeah, so they're my 3 levels of planning ahead, accepting what it is, peer support, massive, you know, your group is great. We've got a carer who comes from Age UK once a fortnight, things like that. And, you know, the group support for the carers when we used to go before COVID, fantastic.
Yeah. So routine and planning for you is really key.
Yeah, because I don't know how anybody could do it without that sort of thing. Like people say, oh no, I just, you know, see what comes. But you're going to have a lot of, like you're saying, distress.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I suppose there's a little bit of it. That's how I look after me as well. By looking after them, I am looking after me.
That's
like, how did I manage to talk today? Is because I got Ian's walking partner to come today to take him exactly at the right time, so that I could have this time talking.
Yeah.
If I just waited, oh, what will I do today?
Yeah.
Well, I couldn't live without amount of stress, to be honest.
Yeah, that's a really good point, isn't it? By managing that sort of potential stress and distress in the person that you're caring for, actually you're by its very nature managing your own to a certain extent as well.
Without a doubt. Yeah.
Was there anything else that either of you wanted to say or to bring up today before we return to finish our presentation?
I wanted to raise an issue which we're all talking about dementia and the symptoms of the disease. And if I can't emphasize enough about knowledge of the disease being key, but the situation I'm currently in is for the last 6 months, I've assumed that Paul was sort of slowly declining. And in March, he had a head injury because he kept fainting and falling backwards and he hit his head and he had to have stitches in his head and everything else. But then afterwards, he was fine and okay. But in the last month, he's been deteriorating quite rapidly. And I've been going backwards forwards to the GP. Oh, the incontinence, that's just dementia, blah, blah, blah. We'll send you for a referral for incontinence clinic or whatever. And all the blood tests, everything came back normal, heart issues, blah, blah, blah. Nobody was taking any notice from it really with me, with the GP, but I was very concerned at how much he had been declining because he was a very active person. Anyway, this Sunday, I took him to A&E. And after all the tests that the doctor did, I said, I can't cope with him anymore. He has this fear factor, as Sue was talking about flight or fight. He was fearful, extremely fearful. I couldn't even get him to sit down on the toilet or anything else. And it was very scary. And I took him to the hospital in the hope that I would get some support with occupational health and everything else. And they finally did a brain scan at 10 o'clock in the evening, and they discovered he had a huge bleed on the brain. And he has a hematoma that was so big that the neurosurgeon says he doesn't understand why he's still alive. And the only reason he's still alive is the fact that his brain has shrunk from his FTD and it has filled the void with blood. So he is currently in a high intensity unit after a major surgery to remove all the blood that's surrounding his brain. So if I'd have listened to the GPs, I suspect he would have been dead by today. So my warnings to anyone is, if your gut instinct is that things are not in the normal scheme of things how you expect the disease to go, you make sure that you keep on at your doctors to be aware of it, because you are the person who knows your partner or your parent or anyone better than anybody else. And you've got to go with that and don't care what they keep fobbing you off. Just keep saying, no, this is not right. And
you, Jill.
sure enough, you know, Paul is just about surviving, hopefully.
Yeah.
And we don't know what damage it's done, but, you know, so that is a lesson to us all, I think.
I'm so sorry to hear that, and thank you so much for sharing that. It's a really incredibly valuable and important point, and I mean that takes a lot of energy from you to keep on keeping on, doesn't it, to do that? But it also, I think, relates to some of these difficulties, these causes that maybe aren't actually around about dementia, and it's that assumption, isn't it, I suppose, that a lot of people make is, well, it's the dementia.
Yes.
And sometimes it's not actually. It could be a physical thing, it could be a metabolic thing, it could be something completely different. So well done for keep banging on, and I really wish him well.
Let's hope he improves anyway. Thank you.
Yeah, he's in the right place now.
He is.
Thank you both so much for that discussion. I'm going to bring us back now so that we can just do our last few slides to end the presentation, and then we can see if there are any questions. So Sue, I'm going to hand back to you. You're on mute.
Thanks for telling me I'm on mute. Thank you. And thanks all. That was brilliant. Discussion has kind of segued me into my last couple of slides brilliantly. I think the thing is, it is about reducing the stress for both of you, whatever it is under that waterline, whether it's physical, whether it's part of the dementia, whether it's extrinsic or intrinsic. And Jill, you know, she said in that moment when she shared that with us, and thank you, Jill, for sharing it with us. It must be really tough, but you know, his physical, what was happening to him physically wasn't just causing him stress that he was fearful. It was causing you stress because, as you said, he wouldn't be able to sit down on the toilet or anything like that. So his stress was also your stress. And I don't think we can underestimate that, or, you know, sort of, we need to give it the credence it requires, really, because it's incredibly difficult. And often, not always, but often when it's young onset dementia, this is someone who is physically very able and very fit and very able to move around. And I know Paul, and I know usually he is very able, and it is exhausting having that walking track in the garden and all of those things. So it's exhausting for both of you, not just for the person with dementia. And as Sarah said, Sarah beautifully said in the things that she said, and someone picked up in it, I know, and has put it in the chat box, about, you said, Sarah, keep him happy keeps me happy. And it really is about, if you can reduce the stress for the person with dementia and melt that bit of iceberg that's causing stress and distress, then it's going to reduce the stress for you as well as a carer. So our golden rules, really, I think Sarah and Jill put it beautifully: avoid confrontation, don't argue about facts, and just choose what things you take to task and what you don't. But what we often underestimate doing, and I think Sarah's told it as beautifully as well, is clarify and comfort. Sometimes we just want to fix it for people and we want to make it all better, and we can't all of the time. So it's often important to remember that just clarifying how someone's feeling, I can see that's upsetting you, I can feel that's really difficult for you, what would you like me to do, can be really, really valuable to people. And then moving on to the next slide, Lizzie, the next one really speaks a bit more to what Jill was saying about knowledge is power and learning to cope. So we talk a lot on our courses about the more that you can learn about something, the more you can understand what's going on. And the more that you can understand what's going on, the more you feel equipped to be able to cope with it. And all that is part of resilience building. The word resilience has always had a bad press in recent years, that it's about, come on, grin and bear it, get on with it, you know, you're stronger than that. And that's not what it's about. It's getting knowledge and learning to be able to support yourself so that in stressful situations you have strategies to be able to cope with it. And yet what tends to happen in the world of dementia is that training is provided to paid care workers, hopefully most of the time high quality training for paid care workers around stress and distress and how we can support someone with the environment, how we can make those extrinsic changes to support someone. But often that's not there for carers. And I think Sarah and Jill both were talking about how much, you know, it really is about learning on the job. It's kind of make it up as you go along. And that's one thing I'd love to see change. You know, lots more carers getting lots more quality training around some of these extrinsic and intrinsic factors, so that you can reduce the stress for the person with dementia and have a better quality of life for that person, but also for yourself as well. So I'm going to hand back to Lizzie now. Thanks, Lizzie.
And finally, our final slide really is that idea about, well, what's important in looking after yourself. And carers all the time tell us that they don't have time to look after themselves. They neglect their own needs. And so that word, that resilience word, is something that we look at a lot on the course, unpick what that means. As Sue said, it's not about grit your teeth and carry on. Actually, it's something much deeper than that. And when psychologists have looked at, well, what factors are important in someone building resilience, it's these 5 things. And it's about self-care. Now, that's a real buzzword as well, isn't it? Self-care. What does that mean? Well, I'm sure what it means for me is different as to what it means for you, and it'll be different for what it means for Jill and Sarah. It's unique again. It's whatever works for you, but it's about, I suppose, what gives you comfort, what recharges you a little bit. For me, a really small thing that recharges me is stroking my cat and sort of having attention on her, because when I'm focused on her, I'm not actually thinking about anything else. I'm just in that moment, gazing into my cat's eyes while she chooses not to scratch me most of the time. And I enjoy that sort of that connection as well. And when we talk about recharging yourself, it's important as well to think about it. You think about your mobile phone when you're out and about and you've got 5% on your phone. You just need somewhere to plug it in, don't you, to get to 20%, because that'll get you through. And when we talk about recharging batteries, we're talking about what little things can you do during the day that will just help you get through. We don't mean, okay, you need an hour, you need some whale song, you need dark lights, you need a massage. You know, that's not going to work for anyone, is it? It's what little things can you do during the day. So for me, if I'm stressed, I can actually just stroke my cat. Having a sense of self, having a sense of who are you? Again, carers will often say, I don't know who I am anymore. I feel like I'm just a carer. But we would say, like, a carer is one of the hats that you wear, but there are lots of other hats that you can still wear. And it's trying to find a way of kind of finding your way back to some of the things that perhaps you like to do, that express who you are, and that give you that sense of self. Relationships are important, and those connections, actually, that's not necessarily always about relationships with people. It can be relationships with, you know, connections with animals. It can be to places, it can be to objects. Sometimes we can look at objects and they will hold precious memories for us, and that takes us somewhere nice, you know, in our minds. And it might be a photo that we look at that just makes us laugh or makes us smile or makes us feel happy. A sense of development, so a sense that you have a purpose, that you are continuing to learn and develop within yourself, is really important for resilience and for having sort of feeling a sense of well-being, I suppose. And that's about sort of learning, and certainly as a carer, I know that you're learning all of the time. But are there other things that you're able to sort of slot in where you feel that you're still developing your own learning? And finally, that sense of belonging, whether it's feeling a part of something. On our courses, we really hope and know really that carers feel part of a wider group of carers. Caring can be such an isolating experience that actually knowing that you're part of a much larger group can be really, really helpful to people. But also, you know, being around like-minded friends, being part of clubs or families or that kind of thing, that sense that you're just not on your own. One last thing I just wanted to bring into this was when we're on our courses, again, thinking about little things that you can do to get yourself through difficult times in the day. We ask people to think about your 5 senses and think about something that you can do under each of those senses that just makes you feel perhaps a little bit calmer and a little less stressed. They're small, they're achievable, and they're free. And I had a quick look before I came on here at what some of the suggestions were from our courses, and I just want to share with you finally some examples of what I mean. So under sight, so seeing, people like looking at their garden, looking at the sea, looking at their dog, looking at photos. Under sound, so under hearing, music, I mean, that's a big one for me. Music always makes me feel better. Listening to the rain, bird song, or listening to voices. Under taste, we had mint sauce, chocolate, obviously, homegrown tomatoes, and cheese and onion crisps. Under smell, we had pine sap, scented candles, horse, I think I know who put that one. And flowers. And finally, under touch, cats, trees. So someone liked hugging trees, soft blanket or a throw, and bubble wrap. These are really small little things. They're not going to change the world. They're not going to make everything better. But in a moment in a day, sometimes just snatching one small thing or two small things can just get you through the next moment. And it's that time as well when you're standing by the kettle and you're looking out the window and you're feeling really tired and you don't know how you're going to cope. A few deep breaths, something like that, can just help you reset and recharge and just build that mobile battery up a little bit. So that's the end of our presentation. So thank you very much for joining us today. So I think probably, Sue, do we need to look in the Q&A now?
Yes, I've looked in the Q&A and we've got two questions at the moment, lots of comments, and thank you for all the comments, and we will take those forward. That's brilliant. So the first question we've had is for Jill and Sarah, actually. What do you manage to do for yourself to de-stress? Sarah, can I come to you first?
Okay, so being the routine person that I am, if we go out of routine and I feel stressed, I just find the sort of quickest, least stressful way to get back into the routine. So let's say if Dad has had a fall and so we can't watch the 1 o'clock news, that's one of my non-negotiables. What I do, I make sure I always record everything I want to watch so that I don't feel stressed out, oh, I didn't get to watch the news. I sort Dad out. As soon as everything's back to the calm plateau, I then go and get my news on record. So the way my day goes is I've got my 3 non-negotiables, which is 8 hours sleep, watch the news and read the paper. If I get those done every day, I feel really happy. So I can juggle them around. Yeah, and I used to do yoga. I had to cancel that because the stress of trying to do the yoga class became more stressful than relieving the stress by doing yoga. So after 3 months of trying to do it, I just cancelled it, and I feel better, even though I think yoga is fantastic. You have to be realistic about what you can achieve.
Great, thanks, Sarah. And it's a really good idea about having those non-negotiables, but also recognizing when something was working for you before, when it isn't working for you anymore and it needs to shift to something else. Thank you. How about you, Jill?
Well, one of the things that I find good for my stress is to try and solve a few problems. So I'm quite interested in trying to develop new fangled gadgets to help with Paul's condition so that it helps me. And for example, during lockdown, when they told us, nobody could go with anybody because you had to keep 2 meters apart. Well, I knew that Paul was never going to keep 2 meters apart from anyone, but he had to keep walking. So I turned a Nordic walking pole into a 2 meter distancing pole, and I got him used to walking with me with it. And once we did it together enough times, then his volunteer and his friends would take over, and he went for miles and miles with friends holding this pole. And if anyone asked questions, the friend would say what was the reason and everything else. So that was I felt that was a real success. And that's that really does sort of satisfy me that I've found a way of solving that issue. But there are things that I've sort of helped myself. Chocolate, of course, is always there for me. Also working out that sugar and caffeine really affected his behaviour. And I prided myself in the fact that because he is compliant, I took that away from him very early on in the disease, and his behaviour was manageable because he didn't have sugar and caffeine. So that it's a bit of a self-satisfaction from knowing that I've done something that helps him, and that helps me. I think that's more or less it, really. I do try and get some other support from various things, and I like actually the fact that I can help other people when they want some advice about something, and that helps me de-stress as well, to help someone else.
Thanks, Jill. I think, over the years, I've known you for a few years now, and you just come alive when you come up with another light bulb moment of how to do something, and willing to share it with everyone. And I see that it gives you a great deal of satisfaction as well. And the sugar thing's really important, because with a lot of people who have a dementia, particularly frontotemporal, they have the sugar cravings. And if they're having a stress and distress response, that release of the sort of stress hormones then requires a use of glucose, and then you're just on a cycle because it uses glucose, they have a sugar craving, and you're just on a vicious cycle. So I know you've found that a really good strategy for looking after yourself as well. Yeah. I think we're nearly out of time, so we've just got the one more question that's in the box, and that's just asking us our courses for family carers and or paid carers, and do people get signposted at the point of diagnosis or soon after? So they're for unpaid carers, so family and friends. It's not limited to one person per family. It's however many we've had generations come together on the courses. We don't at the current time have courses for paid carers because that's not what our charitable funds are set aside for. That people get signposted at all times. We have people come into our courses who are who haven't got a diagnosis yet, some people who have had a diagnosis for many years, and it's a real mix of people in the room, which I think Jill particularly really relished, because it was that learning from each other and learning from the different types of dementia and being able to use all of those opportunities. So so I don't think people are necessarily learning too late. I think sometimes people can find it emotional, because one thing we hear a lot is people say, I wish I'd known this before. I wish I'd known it when I was at that stage. But there's lots of takeaways all of the time for whatever stage people are at. Lizzie, did you want to add anything more to that?
No, I think you've covered that. That's great, yeah. So I think that's it, isn't it, really? So should we hand back to Tessa? Thanks, everyone.
Tessa magically appears.
Where is she? I can't.
No, I am truly showing, I hope. You four have been absolutely marvellous. There's been so much honesty, realism, small things that we could all take on, so much knowledge exchange, so much expertise this is all based in. You've been fabulous, and the chat will share with you and reflects that. So thank you so much for your contribution today. Fabulous. Just to say also thank you very much to all the attendees for being a lively part of today's webinar through the chat and through the questions. We'll share within the next 48 hours or so the presentation, the recording, and lots of useful links that Lissy has offered to us. We'll share those out in the next 48 hours. And also to remind you to look out for the next Tea Time webinar, which is activity and the benefits of cognitive and physical activity to the person with young onset from all different perspectives. So we've got people with young onset who are experiencing the very best from the lovely activities that YPWD Barks offer. So that's our next webinar. Do look out for it. In the meantime, thank you so much, panelists and attendees, for coming, and thank you.
Thank you.